In the early weeks of 2026, at a ski resort in the Swiss Alps, the Prime Minister of a nation that had spent 8 decades under American security protection stood in front of leading figures in global finance and delivered remarks that Canadian leaders rarely voice. He stated that the former international structure was not returning, not merely on hold, but finished. Mark Carney's speech at Davos in January of 2026 did not resemble a typical diplomatic address. It sounded more like a formal farewell, with the system being laid to rest described as the rules-based international order that had shaped Canada's post-war identity. Carney told the Davos audience that for decades, countries such as Canada had thrived within what was labeled the rules-based global system. Ottawa had joined its institutions, endorsed its ideals, and benefited from its stability and predictability, allowing it to pursue a values-driven foreign policy under the shield of American dominance. But then came the key admission. He said Canada had long understood that this narrative was only partly true, that the most powerful states often exempted themselves when it suited their interests, that global trade rules were applied unevenly, and that international law was enforced with different intensity depending on the actors involved. By diplomatic standards, it was an acknowledgement that the system had always functioned with distortion, and that Canada had chosen convenience over confrontation by not stating it openly. What made this moment stand out was not only the message, but the timing and the speaker. Carney is not a traditional political figure driven by domestic theater. He led the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis, and later headed the Bank of England during Brexit. He understands monetary systems, capital movement, and institutional trust at a level few prime ministers ever have. When someone with that background tells a global audience in Davos that the core assumptions of the post-war structure were always a comfortable illusion, the statement carries exceptional weight, and the context matters further. This came about 1 year after Donald Trump returned to the White House following months of tariff threats, remarks about Canada becoming the 51st state, and a trade relationship that had shifted toward coercive pressure. The speech was therefore not theoretical but grounded in lived political tension. The framework Carney has begun shaping since taking office in March of 2025 now has a label, even if not fully institutionalized. Analysts and advisors describe it as values-based realism or strategic internationalism built around what he calls variable geometry. Under this approach, Canada would no longer structure its foreign policy around a single alliance system or dominant partner. Instead, it would form flexible coalitions depending on the issue, aligning with different countries based on shared interests in areas like artificial intelligence governance, critical mineral supply chains, or Arctic security. As Carney explained during a visit to Ireland in June of 2026, no single institution, no one grouping, and no individual country would hold all answers in this evolving environment. He added that nations must define their priorities clearly and then pursue the partnerships required to achieve them. That statement, delivered in County Mayo, became one of the clearest expressions of his governing philosophy over the past 16 months. Defense expansion is the most visible and expensive part of this shift, marking the largest transformation in Canadian military posture since the early Cold War. Carney has pledged to meet NATO's 2% of gross domestic product defense target, originally scheduled for the end of 2030 but brought forward to 2026. He is also committed to NATO's newer 5% of gross domestic product target by 2035. Behind those commitments is a major procurement program that would have been unthinkable for Canada a decade ago. This includes plans for a dozen submarines, with South Korea's Hano Ocean competing against Germany's Thyssen Marine Systems for the contract. It also includes 88 fighter jets, with Canada's existing F-35 commitment under review, and Sweden's Gripen considered as a possible mixed fleet alternative. There are also over-the-horizon radar systems developed alongside Australia and 15 destroyers built domestically. Carney has already moved quietly on part of the fighter jet program by purchasing 14 additional F-35 aircraft, while still maintaining the broader review process. Defense analysts view this as an acknowledgement of strategic reality beneath a surface narrative of flexibility. The guiding logic, as Carney outlined at the Monk School in June of the previous year, is that middle powers face a stark choice in the emerging global environment. Either sit at the decision table or become the subject of decisions made by others. Even as defense budgets continue to rise, the budget of Global Affairs Canada has been reduced from just over $9 billion in the 2025 to 2026 fiscal year to $2 billion in 2026 to 2027. Critics, including analysis published in Policy magazine, argue that this reveals a contradiction within Carney's stated doctrine. He aims for Canada to operate as an essential middle power, deeply embedded across multiple regions and capable of assembling coalitions when needed. That form of diplomacy depends heavily on trade officers, diplomatic staff, and long-term institutional ties that cannot be replaced by military procurement alone. Some observers draw a historical comparison to 1950. when Lester Pearson, then serving as External Affairs Minister, supported both higher defense spending and a strong, well-resourced diplomatic service at the same time, treating them as mutually reinforcing rather than competing priorities. Lester B. Pearson is used in this comparison as a benchmark for a dual-track approach. The critique directed at Carney is that his strategy may be expanding Canada's military capacity as a serious middle power, while simultaneously weakening the diplomatic infrastructure required to apply that power effectively and with precision. Where the concept of variable geometry becomes tangible is in the Indo-Pacific region. This area is widely viewed as the most successful element of Carney's first 16 months in office. According to analysis from the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, the most significant achievement has been the normalization of relations with India, after a prolonged breakdown linked to allegations that Indian government operatives were connected to the killing of a Sikh separatist leader on Canadian territory. Carney moved quickly to repair this relationship. His visit to India in March of 2026 resulted in new agreements and a joint commitment to finalize a comprehensive economic partnership by the end of the year. Both sides also discussed a long-term target of increasing bilateral trade to $70 billion by 2030. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand has described this shift as part of a diversification strategy, emphasizing that Canada is the only G7 nation with free trade agreements covering all other G7 members. The focus, she argues, is now on activating existing agreements rather than producing new symbolic frameworks. During the same diplomatic push, Canada also established a comprehensive strategic partnership with Japan and expanded cooperation with Australia in defense, critical minerals, and advanced technology sectors. China presents a more complex case, resisting simple interpretation as a shift from one bloc to another. Relations between Ottawa and Beijing had already deteriorated significantly in previous years. However, Carney met Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the APEC summit in South Korea in October 2025. Both sides described that encounter as a turning point. Carney followed this with a 3-day visit to China in mid-January 2026, during which a preliminary agreement in principle was reached. Under the emerging framework, Canada plans to reduce tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to approximately 6%, while China is expected to lower tariffs on Canadian canola oil and other agricultural exports. Carney told reporters that the progress and resulting partnership placed Canada in a stronger position within what he referred to as the New World Order. This adjustment stands out because only months earlier, Canadian officials had been warning that China represented a challenge to sovereignty and security. Analysts describe the shift as a pragmatic recalibration rather than an ideological reversal. The reasoning is that in a period of rising dependence risk tied to an unpredictable trading relationship with Washington, Canada requires additional strategic flexibility. That flexibility includes selective economic engagement with Beijing in areas such as agriculture and energy, while maintaining caution in security and technology domains. This leads into the capital strategy, which Royal Bank of Canada trade analysis has characterized as a capital-first approach rather than a trade-first model. During official visits through Mumbai, Sydney, and Tokyo earlier in the year, the emphasis shifted away from signing new trade agreements for symbolic value and toward attracting investment into Canadian infrastructure, critical mineral processing, semiconductor production, and energy development. One of the clearest examples is IFM Investors, an infrastructure fund linked to Australian pension capital, which announced plans to invest up to $10 billion into Canada. The underlying logic is that capital inflows can build physical systems, such as ports, rail networks, and processing capacity, creating the foundation that makes trade diversification operational rather than theoretical. Carney argued this point in Davos, stating that diversification is not only economic caution, but also the structural basis for credible foreign policy, since countries gain the ability to act on principles only when they are less exposed to economic retaliation. In his view, it is difficult for Canada to advocate strongly on global issues, while roughly 3/4 of its exports remain dependent on a single market capable of applying economic pressure. Energy now sits at the core of this diversification strategy, representing the area where Canada retains its strongest form of leverage. Carney's government reached a memorandum of understanding with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith to move forward with a new oil pipeline from Alberta to the British Columbia coast. The agreement also exempts the project from certain climate rules, including the greenhouse gas emissions cap. It has triggered strong opposition from the government of British Columbia, multiple First Nations groups, and parts of Carney's own Liberal caucus. Among the internal political fallout was the resignation of former Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault from the cabinet. This reflects the less visible domestic cost behind the broader diversification strategy. Expanding export routes for Canadian crude toward Asian markets requires navigating highly contentious political ground at home. Carney has demonstrated willingness to commit political capital to this conflict, calculating that reducing dependence on the American energy market outweighs the internal friction it creates. Attention now shifts to a more immediate pressure point that sharpens the entire strategy. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement review deadline set for July 1st. Under Article 34, 7 of the agreement, the three countries must formally state by that date whether they intend to extend CUSMA for another 16 years or move into an alternative review process. Both Canada and Mexico have clearly expressed support for renewal. Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc sent a formal notification to his American and Mexican counterparts in early June, reaffirming Canada's position while acknowledging Washington's call for adjustments, especially regarding automotive rules of origin and dairy market access. The Trump administration has delivered mixed signals throughout June. On June 10th, Trump told reporters in the Oval Office that he was not seeking to renew the agreement. By June 17th, after returning from the G7 summit in France, he escalated his position further, stating at Orly Airport that CUSMA could potentially expire immediately and that he would prefer termination over continuation. However, trade specialists note a key distinction. Not seeking renewal is not the same as formal termination, which would require 6 months' notice under the treaty. A Republican Senate Finance Committee review in 2020 also concluded that full termination could not proceed without congressional approval. Despite the political rhetoric, major American industry groups are actively lobbying to preserve the agreement. This includes the National Association of Manufacturers, agricultural industry organizations, and the Automotive Coalition representing General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis. They argue that CUSMA supports American manufacturing competitiveness rather than weakening it. The first formal trilateral review session is now scheduled as a virtual meeting on July 1st. Mexico's Secretary of Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, confirmed the arrangement with officials from all three countries, acknowledging that the session will not resolve all outstanding issues and that additional meetings will follow later in July. Following his discussions with Trump at the G7 summit in Evian, Carney adopted a carefully measured tone. He noted that the American president has not been a strong supporter of CUSMA in recent years, but emphasized that specific areas of cooperation remain open for negotiation. Dominic LeBlanc described his separate meeting with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer on the sidelines of the G7 as constructive, highlighting progress on addressing specific concerns raised by Greer. Trade analysts, including Canadian-American trade lawyer Mark Warner, generally interpret the situation as a negotiating strategy. In this view, Trump's position is intended to maximize leverage ahead of intensified talks, rather than signal an actual plan to dismantle a deeply integrated trade system that connects the auto, energy, and agriculture sectors across all three economies. All of these developments, including defense expansion, diplomatic recalibration, Indo-Pacific engagement, selective economic opening with China, energy infrastructure disputes, and CUSMA tensions, point to a single underlying conclusion formed by Carney. He has stated more directly than any recent Canadian leader that Canada can no longer treat its relationship with the United States as a fixed structural pillar of national strategy. Instead, it must be viewed as one variable among several important but no longer dominant factors. Carney has repeatedly framed this idea in speeches from Davos to Dublin to the G7 summit in Evian. He argues that middle powers now face a choice between competing individually for influence under great powers or cooperating to form what he calls a third pathway with real collective leverage. Whether this doctrine holds under the pressure of implementation remains uncertain. Delivering investment, finalizing trade deals, and managing a deeply integrated relationship with the United States will determine its durability. The speeches have been delivered and the coalitions have been outlined. What happens next, beginning with a virtual meeting on July 1st, will determine whether this marks a true transformation of Canada's global position or simply the most detailed articulation yet of a country trying to expand its room to maneuver. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.